So, Mr. Secretary, we'll start with a pretty general one. You've been critical of a lot of the economic policies coming out of the Trump administration. Is there one specific policy that you think is most dangerous?
Probably their approach to the global economy. Viewing the global economy as all about win-lose rather than about cooperation undermines prospects everywhere. That's there in their attitude towards trade wars. That's there in their attitude towards international institutions. That's there in their rhetoric towards other countries. And what we know is that we've had an experiment when the world moved towards nationalism, moved towards zero-sum thinking in economics. It was the late 1920s and the early 1930s, and it didn't end very well. And so I think on broad national security grounds, and as well as on grounds of U.S. prosperity, the orientation of the administration towards global economic policy is very dangerous. If we were looking to help China, it's hard to imagine a better strategy than the one we have pursued of abandoning our TPP allies, of being so truculent that other countries have rallied to China's side, of hamstringing our producers by raising their input costs with tariffs, and by alienating the rest of the world with our unpredictability. I mean, it is a feat of diplomacy for South Korea and Japan to now regard us as a greater threat to their security than they regard North Korea as being.
You really think that's true?
I think their greatest fear, if you talk to them, is that we will launch some kind of military confrontation of which they will be the victims.
And yet, the Trump administration has succeeded, at least, in bringing Kim Jong-un to the table. So I'm just wondering, as it relates to trade and
doesn't
economic
know what it
policy.
means. Yes, they have succeeded in giving Kim Jong-un more prestige than any North Korean leader has ever had by putting him in a symmetric relationship at a negotiating table with the President of the United States. That is a gift to him. Whether as a consequence of that gift they will extract meaningful progress remains to be seen, and perhaps they will, and certainly we're all rooting for them to succeed. But one should not confuse a country with a negligible GDP having its leader sit with the President of the United States with an achievement for the President of the United States.
Do you blame Secretary Mnuchin for the economic policies coming out of this administration?
Yeah, I think ultimately presidents get the advisors and the cabinet members they deserve. I do think the policies are fairly systematically short-sighted and run long-run dangers. I spoke about what's involved in their approach to international economic policy, their approach of heavy fiscal stimulus in the ninth year of an expansion, impoverishes the public sector over time, and just sets the stage for larger fiscal problems in the future, and it fires off our ammunition before we have a problem. We will have a next recession, and we won't be able to fire the fiscal cannon because the administration's policies have already shot it off.
More and more talk about an eventual recession. Do you have any prediction on when that would be?
I think the odds of a recession are about 20% a year. That means that it's better than even that we'll have one sometime in the next 3 years. Exactly when, I don't know. What scares me is the brittleness of the economy. We've already used up a substantial part of the fiscal policy room, and with interest rates where they are, normally we get out of recessions by cutting interest rates by 500 basis points, and we're not going to have anything like 500 basis points of room to cut interest rates.
Do you give the Trump administration credit for anything?
I think they have connected and shown that they care about a large number of Americans in the middle of the country who have felt disconnected from national policymakers who have seemed responsive to coastal elites. I don't like the specific measures that the Trump administration has taken, and I think for the most part they will backfire against those they profess to help. But I think establishing that sense of connection is something that is important for leaders to do.
What about Amazon? The president has targeted Amazon in tweets for everything from taxes to hurting retailers. Does Amazon deserve that kind of scrutiny from the president?
First of all, presidents should not be singling out particular companies for attack. That's the stuff of Mussolini or Perón, not the stuff of the United States. There should, of course, be systematic examination of the economic policy issues that are raised by the very rapid growth and substantial scale of a company like Amazon. I think there are very large issues around the taxes paid, or more accurately, frequently, not paid by the major technology companies, and that certainly should be an object of study by those concerned with tax reform. I think wherever there is big data, there are legitimate concerns about privacy and the dissemination of that data, and that public policy is lagging way behind in that area. I think antitrust should look at competitive practices. I don't think that growing by providing products at low cost is monopoly. And so insofar as Amazon is just being a really effective retailer, that is not a reason for antitrust. But of course, if they're pursuing anti-competitive practices, they're denying suppliers the right to supply to them if they supply to other people, if they're doing things of that kind, of course those kinds of things should be investigated. But it's really dangerous for there to be a world where businesses feel they have to stay on the right side of the President of the United States, or he will use the awesome powers of the U.S. government to retaliate.
Or social
and
media.
So that, social media, but that social media is a signal to the thousands of political appointees in the government as to how they should behave. So I have found from the beginning of this administration that its emphasis on what might be called deals capitalism rather than what might be called rule of law capitalism is very problematic. That's the stuff of struggling emerging markets, not the stuff of the United States. And I think over time, it takes a real toll in terms of the predictability of the business environment, in terms of the willingness of firms to be based in America, to innovate in America.
Finally, I wanted to ask you about what we're seeing in the bond market, because things seem to change in the last week or few weeks or so. 2-year yields are at a decade high. We saw a big jump in 10-year yields, though mostly curve flattening. What do you make of the messages we're getting from bonds right now?
I think markets are seeing more evidence of inflation accelerating, and therefore they're expecting more Fed action, and that's showing up disproportionately in the 2-year, but it's showing up to some extent in the 10-year, and therefore you get a flattening of the curve. Insofar as it's driven by evidence of economic strength and driven by some evidence of rising inflation towards and above 2%, I don't think it's something that one should see as terribly ominous. In fact, I think there's probably something somewhat benign about it. What I worry about is whether we have an economy that can sustain strong growth with a strong financial foundation. Yes, we can get growth if we run massive budget deficits, we have a massive Fed balance sheet, we keep interest rates very low, but that ultimately undermines financial stability. And so the question is, can we find a formula for growth with sustainable finance? And I'm not so sure that we've quite figured that out, and that's why I view the near term in a relatively calm way, but I'm more troubled by the medium term for our economy.